Let's do a quick overview of data science and machine learning. Of course, we could spend whole courses on this, but just to give you kind of the high-level picture, the classic definition of data science is that it's the intersection of math stats knowledge, hacking skills, computer science stuff, and either business knowledge or scientific knowledge if you want to do data science for chemistry or biology or something like that. So Drew Conway came up with this Venn diagram based on that idea. Other people have come up with other Venn diagrams saying basically the chance that you'll find someone who's an expert at all three of those is pretty low, as rare as finding a unicorn. But you can find people who are good at maybe combinations of those and all put a team together that together is a data science team. It's interesting to note that a lot of schools created data science programs by putting together some classes in math and stats and some classes with computer science, but often didn't include the business school. But EMU in our undergrad data science program does include the business school. I'll talk more about that in a sec. And then, like any good picture, someone had to come up and make a sort of spoof version of it, but it's worth thinking about. There's a saying that a data scientist can code better than any statistician and can do stats better than any plain coder. So that's a way you want to think of it. Still leaves out the business aspect. I'm one of the lead advisors on the EMU undergraduate data science and analytics degree. It's basically like minoring in math stats, minoring in computer science, and minoring in business information systems. And then there's your choice of 3 concentrations. You choose one of them. A theoretical one that kind of prepares you for grad school, web analytics, that's all business and information systems, or advanced data analysis, which is more preparation to go straight into the workforce. So if you have any questions about that program, please ask me. Data science often involves big data. It doesn't have to, but what's a definition of big data? You could say it's roughly data that can't be stored or processed on a single machine. How big is that now? Well, it's a lot bigger than it used to be 20, 30, 50 years ago. How much data would you say you can reasonably store on a machine? Well, each hard drive is a terabyte or 2, so if you have a really beefy machine, you'd say dozens of terabytes. Once you get above dozens of terabytes, you need either a bunch of different machines to store it or a really, really expensive machine. But can you process dozens of terabytes on a single machine? Well, it can take a long time just to load in a terabyte of data, even if you want to take the mean. So just to reasonably process stuff, you probably need your files to be down in the dozens of gigabytes, maybe. And of course, these numbers will go up over time, but that's roughly a way to think of what big data is. When big data first became a term, the way we dealt with it was using an algorithm or method called MapReduce and software called Hadoop. But I think a lot of people would say that those are fading these days. Apache Spark is still going fairly strong, I think. It does both the storage and some mathematical processing, some machine learning, and Apache has other related packages. There's a kind of database called SQL, or SQL, and then people broke out of the SQL mode and said there's databases that are not only SQL, like MongoDB and Cassandra and stuff. If you want to learn more about those, take some big data courses in our computer science department. Let's talk about classical machine learning, and by classical I mean roughly 10, 20 years ago. Some people would say that it's basically multivariable statistics. I heard someone say once that machine learning, or that data science is statistics done on a Mac by people wearing black turtlenecks. So I don't know about that. Classical machine learning you can break down into 2 types, either supervised or unsupervised. So supervised, the data has y values and you're trying to predict the y values. They might be continuous or they might be discrete or binary or something. In unsupervised learning, you have x variables that describe things, but no kind of outcome variable that you're trying to predict. In supervised learning, we're often trying to classify things if the output variable is discrete, like does this picture have a stop sign in it or not, or does it have a kitty cat in it or not, for example. In unsupervised learning, we're just trying to say what kind of groups is the data in, what kind of knowledge can I extract from this data without picking on one variable as the output variable. So here's an example that I've been using. Someone said, malaria is an important disease in the world, but it's only transmitted by one or a few types of mosquitoes, and the other kinds of mosquitoes are harmless as far as malaria goes. So we'd like to be able to know, are the mosquitoes in a region, do they have this one species or not that can carry malaria? And so they set up a laser to act kind of like a microphone to detect the wing beats and analyze the frequency of the wing beats and something about their pattern. And so here's data from 5 different insect species. I don't think all of them are mosquitoes, but they're things that you might detect out in real life. And they're colored by which insect species they are. So if you gave this data to an algorithm, could it kind of draw a line here to separate this red cluster from all the others, and draw a line here to separate the blue cluster from the green cluster and all the others, and draw a line here? So that's one way of thinking of it. So we'd be taking the frequency data and something about the pattern of the frequency changes and trying to classify what kind of insect it is. This is called supervised because the algorithm could get the data, make a prediction, and then kind of find out whether the prediction was right or wrong. That's kind of saying a supervisor saying, no, that was wrong, or yes, that was right. So that's why we call it supervised. If we didn't know which insects made which sounds, then we would not have these color codes. And then we might say, well, just based on this data, what kind of groups are out there? And we might say, okay, well, here's a cluster. Here's another cluster. Here's another cluster. Here's a cluster. That's kind of weird. Maybe that's the fault of some data processing algorithm. I bet it is, because I'm the one who wrote it. And so you can see it's not entirely clear. Like, well, maybe there's a cluster division here. It's not always clear how many clusters you should end up with. That's the 2 ways of thinking often, and then we'll talk about later other ones. Let's talk about some algorithms, and we'll just mention some names. You can look them up later. The confusing thing is there's one for classifying called k-nearest neighbor, where for any data point that you don't know what group it's in, you look at maybe the 3 nearest data points or the 5 or 7, and you kind of have them vote on which, like if the nearest ones are green, they vote green, and if the nearest ones are blue, they vote blue. And whichever category wins the vote, that's what you name that one. And then you have to decide, do you look at the nearest 3, the nearest 5? How do you measure distances? K-means for clustering. It's not an analogy in terms of algorithm, but the names are often similar and confuse people. I have to stop and think about it every time. For k-means, you kind of put down a point here and a point here and a point here. At least you hope they end up there. And you say, how far is each data point from this point or that point or that point? And whichever one it's closest to, that's what cluster it's in. And you take means of locations to determine where those cluster centers are. Here's some other names for algorithms for supervised learning and unsupervised learning. I'm not saying that hierarchical clustering is analogous to support vector machines or that this is analogous to that. It's just lists of algorithms. Classical regression is included in here, multiple regression, and then regression that tries to select which variables are important or not. Neural networks, these days I'd say are mostly used for classification. You can use them for clustering. And so remember, this was supervised learning, this is unsupervised learning. And then there's semi-supervised learning, which is also called reinforcement learning, where there are y values, but you don't find out right away whether a decision you made was good or not. You might have to wait till the end of a game, and you find out whether you won or not based on all the moves you made, and you have to go back and say, okay, which of those moves kind of contributed to it, which moves didn't. This is how computers first learned to beat people in backgammon in the 1990s using a neural net and reinforcement learning. More recently, AlphaGo was the first computer program to beat humans in Go. AlphaZero extended that to chess and a Japanese version of chess. And then Mu0 is the extension of those, which can also play classic Atari video games. So there's lots of interesting stuff going on in reinforcement learning. 2 other things, Markov decision processes, which we talk about in math 419, 519, and dynamic programming, which we talk about in both 560 and 419, 519, all fall under the semi-supervised or reinforcement learning paradigm. There's something called a multi-armed bandit, which is actually used to decide which kind of ads to serve people, or which interface to a web page to try and see whether people donate more money, for example. The idea is sometimes you want to spend time exploring options and seeing how good each one is. And then once you have a fairly good idea of how good each option is, you want to start exploiting what you know and start using more of the good option and not so much of the not so good option. So that's an interesting way to think of it. Neural networks, we'll talk about that in separate videos. Another way to think about how machine learning and stats are different is that machine learning tends to focus on making good predictions, even if humans don't end up understanding how the machine learning is working to give those predictions. Like, you get a whole bunch of coefficients on stuff, but it's hard to really trace through the logic. Where traditional stats says, let's make a model where we're saying, well, here's this factor and this factor and this factor, and we'll put coefficients on them, and a fairly simple, like linear or quadratic. And you really takes a let's understand things point of view, which you could say is sort of science. Science is like understanding how the world works, and engineering is, hey, let's make the world better. And you would hope that the engineers are doing some science to understand what things are going on, but not always. It's a paper that talks about the two cultures here is statistical modeling the two cultures, so I recommend reading that. And then a sort of skeptical article about data science is this one, so that's a good one too. To wrap up, let's look at a tweet, the source of all wisdom. This tweet is actually from someone else's presentation, and it says that data scientists should be able to do all these things. Note that this one is actually kidding. You should not hack p-values. That's a stats thing. Come talk to me about it. Data scientists should be able to do all this stats and coding things, and do all these more traditional coding things. And here's that domain knowledge. And it wraps up with this quote. It's actually parodying something from a science fiction author. But here's my big question. What is not on this list that should be on this list? Take a sec to look at it. Well, here's my answer to what is not on this list that should be on this list, at least one thing. Maybe consider possible unintended consequences, if I could spell that, or work together with people who would be affected by the projects and hear what their goals are, not just your business goals, for example. So we'll talk more about that in another module.